about now moving into the secondary world. And so as Yat spoke really clearly about, the world is changing so fast. We're experiencing even ever more now amidst the pandemic. But we don't know what the workplace will look like 10 years from now, and so it's critical that schools do things differently in order to prepare our students for this rapidly changing world. And so as we think about staying true to the DSHK guiding statements, thinking about our constructivist pedagogy and emphasis on STEAM, we really feel like there's 4 areas that can really help us make sure that we are preparing our students for success in the 21st century. And so the first 2 triangles I'll talk about, we see as those really fundamental 21st century skills. So that center triangle being those core subjects and global themes. And those are going to be things that are going to feel probably fairly familiar to all of us. But then that green triangle represents the information and media technology skills. These are things that are really unique to the 21st century and things that have been brought up both by the Partnership for 21st Century Skills and the Smart City report that was shared in 2017. But as Yat said, this is not enough. When you think about how quickly the world is changing, students have so much access to technology. I think very often they're overstimulated. So we have to also equip them with really strong human skills. And so when we think about the other 2 triangles, making sure that students have a really high EQ, right? An emphasis on emotional intelligence. And then that triangle at the top, making sure that everything gives the students an opportunity to really be creative and to hone in on those creativity and innovative skills so that we really do help cultivate the 21st century leaders. And so now when we think about DSHK doing secondary, there are many secondary options in Hong Kong already, and we really want to be something that is unique and different. And so when by staying true to our guiding statements, you see that much of this will look familiar, but when we think about secondary, we start to bold things like the importance of innovation. So really giving students a lot of ownership and voice in their instructional program so they can really be innovative. This continuing the push towards bilingualism. So our students will be able to continue kind of in this Putonghua English setting, but also, as Yat said, computer programming is really a new and necessary language. So making sure that students do really develop a strong core in their computer programming skills. But this has to be balanced with those personal development and expression skills that are rooted in our Chinese virtues and values. But then also you see the word bolded at the bottom, a focus on entrepreneurship. So we have our motto, I am not led, I lead. So really giving students that opportunity to be leaders of their learning, leaders of projects, internships. So we're going to give some kind of color and context to what this will look like. So when we think about kind of phase 1, we're thinking about middle school. And so as we've designed middle and high school, we're really planning with the end in mind. And our goal is really to try to ensure that every child that goes through the full Dalton pathway has the best, greatest opportunities and access to things when they graduate. And so when we think about middle school, we're thinking again about grade levels 6 through 8. So this will fall similar to an American system. And we're thinking that initially that will take place at West Kowloon. And then in our hope is to get our curriculum guide out to you this spring so that you can kind of see the real nitty gritty details of the curriculum with a target opening of the fall of 2022. So again, that would allow our current P4s to be 6th graders in our middle school. And so as we start to plan out middle school, we see 2 streams happening. So the first would be continuing along that dual language stream, which would really be fitting for most of our students who are currently in the primary school or the kindergarten. And so when we're talking about dual language, we're talking about 50% of their instruction in Chinese and 50% in English in their core subject areas. And then for some students, those who have a real kind of passion for STEAM, making sure that they have an accelerated STEAM option so that if they want to take calculus or statistics in high school, that they'll have that opportunity. An important note here in middle school as well, though, and I know that many of you had this question this year and in years past as well, what about simplified characters? So as we think about 6th grade, this is where we see it as students having the option. So students can choose to either continue with traditional characters, or at that stage, they could choose to work with simplified. So we're able to offer both at that stage. In addition to the dual language track, though, we also plan to offer an international stream. And this would be for students who may be new to the school at this stage, or maybe if it's a student who knows that beyond high school they know they want to study in an English-based university, then this might be something that feels like a more viable option for them. And so within the international stream, students would do most of their core in English, but they would also be expected to take on a world language. That could be, like a beginner Putonghua, or maybe something else like Spanish or Korean, but being able to have another language. But regardless of whichever stream students are in, they would still have that opportunity to be in that accelerated STEAM. And so now just to go a little more detailed in terms of the dual language versus the international stream. So when we talk about the core, this has been in the dual language stream, this is where we're talking about a 50-50 model. So in Chinese, students would be engaging in Chinese language arts and Chinese history and global studies. So those subject areas would all be conducted in Chinese. And then in English, they would be engaged in English language arts and STEAM. But then their electives would be mixed languages. So it could be in English, it could be in Chinese, but they would be in those kind of key areas that from our triangle, right? So the creative arts, media and information technology literacy, some opportunity for sports, STEAM. Even dual language students could decide to add a third language. They might take a world language as an elective, and then also serve as an experiential projects that are student driven. We don't have names on our electives yet because we really think it's important that students have some voice in the design of these electives, but we do have anticipatory planning around these kind of themes and broad topics that we want our electives to be about. So when we think now about an international stream, you can see that the difference here is that the core now is predominantly in English. So you're going to have your English language arts, Chinese history and global studies, and STEAM all facilitated through English. But then students will be required to take on a world language. So that might be something like Mandarin or Spanish, but this is something where we'll also gather some feedback from students and parents, because it might be, again, like another language that students might want to study, but just knowing that it's important that we do add on another world language. And then as far as electives go, notice that this table looks identical to the dual language stream, and that's intentional so that students have actually the opportunity to mix across streams, and that they're going to still all be working within those kind of anchoring areas. And so now when we think about high school, we're thinking about grades 9 through 12. And the goal then is to have a new permanent campus with a target opening of fall of 2025. And so with high school age students, this is where I think you can really see how the Dalton plan comes to life. So when we talk about the Dalton plan, we're talking about house, lab, and assignment. And so I'm going to talk to you, a key part about house is going to be the advisory. And so your house would be a mixed age group, and advisory is a really, really special and important part of the high school experience, particularly when we think again about navigating a rapidly changing world. Advisory really does two main things for students. Number one, it creates a sense of community belonging. And number two, it provides that extra support and accountability to help students navigate a really open and flexible learning plan. So you've got this kind of cohort of peers that really helps you feel like you're part of that Dalton community. But then you've also got specific adults who are really looking out for you across your learning journey, making sure that you're staying on top of your long-term projects, making sure that you're keeping up with your exam schedule. So that advisory is a really, really important part of each child's high school experience. And then lab is something that is also a fundamental part of the high school experience. This is where there's a real focus, again, on trying to support the individual interests and needs of a child. So there's going to be a lot of peer-to-peer learning happening through lab. But again, that's a place where students can get that extra one-to-one support that they need to support them. And then assignment, very excited. We think there's some really creative things that we can do with the long-term assignments. And so we'll give you some examples of that. And especially as we start to think about grades 11 and 12, we think that there's some really amazing things that our students can do. And so what would the coursework look like? So what we're looking at now is having a core subject areas that are really rooted in the AP or advanced placement classes, so that students in AP classes are something that are internationally recognized. So whether it's North America, the UK, Australia, these are classes that would be recognized in all of these countries. And so looking at a core curriculum in AP English and Global Studies, Mathematics and Sciences, but also making sure that computer science is part of that, since that's something that we know is so important for the 21st century. and then a core in the world language. So if students do want to continue their Mandarin, they would be able to do that, but also if they want to add on another language, that's their option as well. Secondly, we start to think about now electives. This is where students get to choose the types of classes that they take. These would be student-driven, and of course, they'd be focused on those outer three triangles that we looked at before. So around creativity, information media and technology, and emotional intelligence. And then the assignment are things that we see as those long-term projects or internships. So what would this look like for a ninth grader? So for a ninth grader, we see you see the core is pretty extensive. That's your first year in high school. So you're going to have your English language arts and global studies, STEAM, an intro to computer science, a world language, and of course that advisory block. And then students will have space in their schedule to take on 2 additional electives. So we just gave some ideas of different electives that we're thinking about now. Notice these titles already look and feel probably a bit different than what we're used to, but this is intentional to really try to keep up with kind of what's happening now, and making sure that students are getting that opportunity to really develop those outer triangles of creativity, emotional intelligence, and MIT literacy. But then an example in ninth grade is that students would really be working on a kind of long-term grade level project that's based on some of the themes that students are grappling with in that grade level. So in ninth grade, the science curriculum has a heavy focus on biology and life sciences. So naturally, if you think about something that would be relevant to now, doing something like tracking the COVID-19 genomic and clinical evolution would be something that would be relevant to the times. But again, those assignments, they'll look different year to year, depending on the cohort, but rooted in those key concepts. But then how does that grow and evolve for an 11th grader? So notice in 11th grade, that core requirement starts to go down a bit. So there's not as many core classes that a student has to take. They're still going to need to take their AP English and Global Studies and still have to take some STEAM work classes and an expanded advisory role, because in 11th grade, that's when a lot of those kind of big exams are happening. So making sure that they're really kind of keeping up and keeping track with that. But then now when we think about possible electives, you can see some of our, the thinking right now. But again, these are things that are works in progress, because we do want to make sure that students have a voice in the design of these electives. And there's also room for them to decide how much or how many and how much they want to spend time in electives. So some students might choose one elective, but to spend a great deal amount of time in that elective. Other students might decide they want to try lots of different things, and so they might choose 3 or 4 electives. That's really going to be up to the child. But we've intentionally designed this so that students really are doing their core classes, first thing in the morning, and then after lunch is when they start to have the flexibility in their schedule, so they could do the third component, which is that assignment or internship or project. So that's where we see where students might be able to do things like, actually do a real internship in the field if they already have like a career interest, or they might be doing a special research incubation project that's sponsored, by a tech company or the school. Or they might be doing something like this, like developing a mini documentary based on something that they're passionate about. So the design of the assignment is something that we do think is very unique to DSHK. And there's really kind of, I think, 2 ways of thinking about it. One is philosophical and the second is practical. So obviously the assignment is something that really is aligned with our philosophical beliefs. So this idea of putting students in charge of their own learning, trusting them to really, create something entirely on their own and manage that process throughout the way. But then from a practical standpoint, when you start to think about things like college admissions, it's very difficult right now for students to be able to distinguish themselves from others, right? Lots of students can have great GPAs. Lots of students can get great test scores. They can get strong teacher recommendations. And we do expect our students to do all of those things. But the things that really set students apart from their peers when it comes to admissions are those kind of extra intangible things. And so for our students, if they have this time and opportunity to really do unique things like internships and incubation projects, some of our students might develop a game or an app through that process. That's something that's going to really make their college admissions, that's going to make them really stand out from their peers. So we're really excited about that. Now, within all of this, though, there are certain kind of, standardized things that we do have to make sure that our students do, again, with that goal of making sure that when they graduate, they have as many opportunities and pathways possible. And so when we think about kind of how that lays out, we think about GPA, exams, and portfolio preparation. So grades 9 to 12 is going to be really where your GPA comes from. And then in grade 10, that's when students would start to take their PSAT, which is the practice SAT. And then in grades 11 and 12, depending on where a child is wanting to apply, they may take the SAT and the ACT, or they may just take one or the other. And we have them start taking that in 11th grade so that they have the opportunity to take it multiple times, just in case it doesn't go as well as they'd like the first time around. In grades 11 and 12, that's also when we would be working on different types of school recommendations. And so that also might be where we're connecting students with different university partnerships. And then in grade 12, depending on the type of university that a child's applying to, that's when you'd really be putting those portfolio things together.